Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another Video Fishing by podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph A.P. Wilson, and today we're going to be talking about is First Corinthians 14:34 to 35 an interpolation. Although it is not lacking in any of the manuscripts of First Corinthians, there are yet scholars out there that suggest that this is an interpolation because these two verses appear to move around in different manuscripts of First Corinthians. So therefore it is hypothesized that it is an interpolation and that different scribes are trying to place these two verses in different places of First Corinthians due to that. But that is their hypothesis. But there are scholars, such as Dr. Wilson here, who believe otherwise and believe that this is actually authentic to Paul and that Paul wasn't actually being a misogynist, but was actually being sarcastic. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Wilson.
Greetings. Thank you. Yeah, and so to recap my position on these very difficult verses, these are like two of the most difficult verses in the New Testament when it comes to women's prerogatives, women's teaching authority, etc. And my position is we could call the QR hypothesis or the quotation refutation hypothesis, where the two verses in question are a quote of the lost original Corinthian correspondence, the letter that Paul received from Corinth. He's taken those as a snippet quote out and responded to them in verse 36, where he says, "What? Did the word of God originate with you?" And he uses a masculine plural pronoun, only ones, or are you the only men who have received it? So his response in verse 36, if it's read as a refutation of 34 and 35, right? It explains why the gender of the pronoun changes and that the audience is the speaker of the previous verse. And so this is a device, this quotation refutation device is a device, a rhetorical device that Paul uses occasionally. It's not the only example of this thing in his authentic letters, but it's one of the most interesting, complicated, really contentious examples. So I'm with other scholars, including my mentor, David Odell Scott at Kent State, who's one of the modern major proponents of this. I'm with in the camp that believes it's a quotation of his opponents that he then refutes with a kind of saying, did the word of God come out of you? Right? Are you like what? Who are you telling? You're trying to tell me that women can't speak? And it explained, and this is because again, throughout the entire epistle, it takes for granted that women can prophesy with their head covered, right? Elsewhere in the New Testament, you have, like, for example, Priscilla in Acts 18 is portrayed as teaching a man in a synagogue context. So, like, there is clear evidence in the New Testament that Paul is associated with women preachers in his personal like circle, and he addresses them, house church leaders and various associates of his were women, and they were all presumably allowed to speak in church. So how could he possibly say otherwise, right? And so this is what the basis for the kind of the general consensus of egalitarian policy, that regardless of whether it's an interpolation or not, it doesn't fit, right? It doesn't, the idea of saying women must sit down and be quiet doesn't fit with the rest of the character of Paul, the authentic Paul. All right. So I wanted to talk about this today, though, because there's been a recent new study that was presented in November at the Society for Biblical Literature annual meeting. And it presented some new evidence that has bearing on the interpolation hypothesis. And so one scholar who is an egalitarian polist who is strongly associated with the interpolation hypothesis is Philip Payne, Payne. And for decades, he has been arguing that there's evidence for the interpolation of these two verses, these two very difficult verses in Codex Vaticanus, which your viewers may know. Codex Vaticanus is one of the oldest complete Christian Bibles. It's probably the oldest, more or less complete Christian Bible. It's got most of the books are there in mostly complete format. right? Sinaiticus is maybe a little younger than Vaticanus. So, and it has some notable text variants because it's a very early, it's like a 4th century manuscript. It has, it's not identical to the later received text in every way. There's a few interesting differences here and there. And Payne, but it has these 2 verses located in the normal place, in the typical place in the first epistle to the Corinthians. So it is, there are no manuscripts, no ancient manuscripts at all that lack these verses. The only question is whether they occur in canonical verse order or whether they occur later at the end of the chapter after verse 40. They're moved after verse 40. That's the typical place you see in the Western and Old Latin and some Syriac, right? So this Western manuscript tradition that arises in 3rd century Italy, that's where you see them displaced. And then you see a couple of Greek manuscripts in the medieval period, minuscule 88, and one other minuscule that's slightly later, a 13th century minuscule that follow the Western order, right? And that's probably because the displaced text was influential in the first years, right? It was actually one of the major, more popular text types from the 4th century to the 9th, something like that. There was a long period when that Western verse order, which is not original and is no longer, and it kind of went out of fashion, went extinct, but that non-typical verse order was actually very prominent for a long time, and eventually it came to influence even the Eastern scribes when you see it show up in medieval Byzantine manuscripts. But right. So, but what I was going to say though is that Philip Payne notes that there are throughout Codex Vaticanus in the New Testament, there are lots of what he calls distigmi. I prefer his older term. He used to call them bars and umlauts, right? Bar umlaut is, I think, more natural. So I'd rather than sound like an idiot trying to pronounce the more current technical term, I'll just call them bar umlauts or dashes. They're like colons that are turned 90 degrees, right? And they appear in the margins. So these little marks, Philip Payne really importantly started to draw attention to these marks in old manuscripts, including Vaticanus, and he said, "Oh, these are text critical marks. These show scribal knowledge of text variation, of different forms of the book." And he made the case, and he has been making the case for decades now, that these marks were there from the 4th century, that they are original to the text. Can you show the picture I have that's, I think, from one of his publications?
Yes, one moment.
And we'll talk about a few examples, and we'll show how he argues based on statistics
Right.
that these are the statistical association with manuscript variants, with known manuscript variants. And so there's 3 in that photo, and then I'll mention 1 or 2 more. All right, yeah, enlarged it a little bit. There we go. Good. Okay, so these, what I will call, for simplicity's sakes, bars and umlauts. You notice how they're sometimes called paragraphoi, right? They're basically paragraph markers, like the way we use indentation when we write. So they mark off sections of text. And you can see at the tops of these lines, right? In all 3 of these examples, you have what? You have a dash under the first letter of the top left of the line, right? And then you have, next to that letter 2, you have 2 dots side by side. And so that would be the bar plus the umlaut, right? This text critical sign that obviously means something because they show up regularly throughout the thing. So Payne basically looked and said, wow, everywhere you see these throughout the New Testament, he says, there's a very high likelihood of a known text, important major known text variants there. And so he's highlighted three examples. In Matthew 13:51 here, this is a pedantic example. So in some ancient manuscripts, it's kind of unclear who's speaking or what the exact context of the conversation is. So some ancient manuscripts insert the phrase, and thus Jesus said to them, something like that. Jesus said to his, so it's basically, it's not significant in terms of doctrine or content-wise, but it's just an example of inserting a phrase for clarity's sake that creates a manuscript variant with different versions. And so the scribe here, the 4th century scribe here, according to Philip Payne, must have been aware of that variant, right, and marked its location in the text. Didn't write out multiple versions or anything. He just wasn't like writing marginal notes. It was just saying, here is a place where this manuscript differs from some other manuscript. Okay. And then going down to Luke 1:28 and 29, that's a famous example of an important manuscript variant. That's where the angel tells Mary that she's favored among women, but in some manuscripts it says that like she's Mary, you're a favored one. But in some manuscripts it says, "Blessed ye are among women," right? Like it follows more the language of the Hail Mary prayer with the important Catholic prayer. So you see basically two slight different variations in language there. And again, you have the bar and the umlaut marking it, which Payne thinks is a 4th century scribal note about the manuscript differences. And then finally, the one that's important for us at the bottom is 1 Corinthians 14:33 through 34, which is, well, actually, so the phrase in question is 34 and 35, but it's the transition to verse 34 where the mark is occurring. And he regards this as indicating that a scribe knew of a text that lacked it at this position. That may be true, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't present at the other position, right? Like if it's missing here, it might still be present at the verse 40 position. So we can't make an inference that this shows a knowledge of a text where it was completely absent. We don't have that text. But the reason why he makes that argument is because there is a similar note, which I don't have a photograph of for you here, but there's a similar note at the key passage in John chapter 7, the end of John chapter 7, and the beginning of John chapter 8. There's like about, I think, 12 verses. Do you know the ones I'm talking about? The woman taken in
adultery. Yeah.
That is one of the most famous major interpolations in the New Testament, like a massive chunk of text that's just shoved in, and it's shoved in it like just like where things move around, right? You see it occasionally in Luke, and you see it in 3 different places in John, including 2 different places in John chapter 7, right? So there's at least 4. It can be absent entirely, the whole section, or it can be present in your manuscript in one of 4 different locations, right? And so Payne's argument was that because that missing passage is marked with, where that the woman taken in adultery should be, but isn't. It's not present in Codex Vaticanus. I don't think. I can't. I need to double check that, but I'm pretty sure this is one of the manuscripts, one of the early manuscripts that lacks it entirely. And so he says, because it's marked there in the same way, right? He makes the inference that the marking of 33 and 34 here is equivalent to that, is indicating a manuscript tradition that doesn't. But this new study, which is done by, well, actually, I should say that it's really 2 papers given back to back at the SBL conference a couple of months ago. One was by Nehemiah Gordon, and one was by Ira Rabin. And both of these scholars took high-tech imaging technology to bear on this question. because Payne has been making the case that these are original to 4th century for a long time because the color of the ink seems to match the rest of the text, right? And there's actually two colors of ink because the Vaticanus was originally written down and then it faded. The letters faded and got really hard to read. And then a scribe went and wrote over the entire thing again. So there's two layers of ink. The first layer and then the restoration layer, right? The second layer of ink on top of the first. And so you can see both layers of ink on the text critical marginal marks. So therefore, Payne said, these colors of ink correspond to the original scribal actions. And that, that they're not modern, they're not inserted by a modern scribe or a medieval scribe much, much later. But what these scholars have done is they've used really high-tech stuff like reflectography using UV light, visible light, and near-infrared light. And they also used a method of X-ray fluorescence, right? So they're using really, really high-tech imaging technology to actually study the molecular composition of the ink. So they're getting the ratios of the different metals in the ink mixture, like copper and iron, right, in their precise levels. And through that, they came up with a really interesting thing. First of all, we didn't know until now, but the rewriting happened very early. So it's likely what happened is the first scribe made Codex Vaticanus with a mixture of ink that wasn't perfect. It was like, we'll call it ink that was improperly mixed. And so it immediately began to fade. So the fading of the first draft happened like within a decade. Like it's less than 10 years old and it's becoming difficult to read. So that means that the writing over, which was done with a very similar ink, like almost like just a tiny bit different. So in other words, the composition of the new ink and the old ink is so similar that it reflects the same kind of, like the same workshop, the same ingredients. Does that make sense? So it gets rewritten right away when it's a very young manuscript. It gets written over again to make it more readable. And the way that they were able to do this is because not every line, not every letter was written over. If there's like, an Omicron that was especially dark, right, the scribe would skip that letter and move on to the next character and trace over that one. So you can use your X-ray fluorescence, or you take that photograph and you do that spectral analysis that gives you the elemental composition of the ink, and you can compare, right, a first draft letter that's not been inked over to one that has, right? And that's how they were able to say that these two scribal tasks were done very close in time to each other, both 4th century, right, or very early. And here's where the problem for Payne's work comes in. Yes, it's true that there are two different colors of ink kind of match, right? That there are scribal marks that have also been inked over with newer ink, and they're these like bar umlauts that we're talking about, umlauts rather. These features of the manuscript, they look superficially like the original text, but actually the ink composition is different and more late medieval or early modern, like 16th century, consistent with that time frame. And that's regardless of whether you're looking at the lighter colored, the so-called apricot colored ink on the manuscript, which is the light colored ink, or the chocolate colored ink on the manuscript, which is the dark colored ink. So in other words, the marginal notations, they also represent the same type of ink as each other, right? But it's a different type of ink versus the rest of the manuscript. So regardless of which color bars and umlauts you're dealing with, according to this study, you're dealing with the work of a later scribe, a much, much later scribe. So how do we explain this? Well, there's another really interesting thing, and this is the work of Peter Head. So Philip Payne's had some critics who have been kind of working on this and critiquing him for a while. Peter Head's work from, I think, 2009, which is also unpublished yet, but he did work that suggested that all of these text critical marks correspond very closely to the same kinds of notes in Erasmus's edition. So do you know who Erasmus is?
Yes.
He's a late medieval, early modern scholasticist, right? He's associated with the sort of the scholastic, the rise of scholastic humanism and Bible study. So what we consider source criticism or critical reading of texts in historiography, it comes later than this. Like that's more like high modern, right? 18th century or whatever, where it gets really serious. But in the roots of early modern scholarship is where you get people comparing manuscripts, saying, look at the differences and similarity between the received text, the Byzantine text, the various families of Bibles and their scribal traditions that they represent, and weighing them out, right? Because like nowadays we think of the King James Bible as being a kind of a bad translation, but for the time it was made, it was really good, right? It was an attempt in the early modern period. The King James was an attempt to make a really text critical, right, rendition, like saying we're not going to just write whatever we have. We're going to weigh the pros and cons of different readings and make critical choices about when two manuscripts disagree with each other, one of them is more reliable than the other. And that requires a complex weighing of options every time you encounter a known variant. So you have this argument that says that the notes in Vaticanus are actually very, very close to the text critical notations in Erasmus's edition, which indicate like 90% similar, which indicates what? That the scribal tradition that produced the marginal notation in Codex Vaticanus is the one that leads directly to Erasmus's work. And sure enough, according to Head, there was an Aristotelian scholar, Juan de Sepulveda, working with Vaticanus as his primary source in the 16th century, who was corresponding, sending letters to Erasmus, who was working on his own critical edition of the New Testament, right? And so that explains why these text critical marginal features are in agreement with the other stuff that's being produced in the late medieval, early modern boundary period. And I know Juan de Sepulveda from my own work. I'm an anthropologist and I study Native Americans. And Juan de Sepulveda is infamous because he was the guy who debated with the famous human rights advocate Bartolome de las Casas. He debated with him about whether slaves were naturally inferior. And so the idea that we have in the modern transatlantic slave trade of congenitally racially inferior slaves, right, that were made by God to be enslaved, that is, or destined by God to be enslaved. That comes right out of Sepulveda's work. So Sepulveda is very notorious, but I just learned, wow, that he was working with this manuscript, and those might be his own marks that he made in this manuscript before he wrote letters to Erasmus about which, and he basically was advocating for certain decisions, right? Like this version is more reliable than that version, and Erasmus ignored some of what he advised him to do and maybe listened to other things. But the point is that these marks suggest that the places where those key decisions were made had to do with these variants, which were maybe unknown in the 4th century. Like the person who produced this didn't know that there was a different version of this manuscript in some other part of the empire, right? You go into Asia Minor or go into North Africa, or they're going to have different versions of the text. But it's by the late medieval, early modern period that scholarship has advanced to the point where the most competent scribes are going to know about multiple variants. They're going to be aware that there are some versions of this document that put this verse at the end of the chapter and not in the canonical position. And so that's why these marks are there. So I tend to think that this may be the end of that argument for Payne. If their work is validated, Payne wants them to make sure that they're. From his comments on some of the blogs that I've read about this, Payne wants them to make sure that they're doing their analysis on the key passages in question. So I don't know that they necessarily use their X-ray um, imaging devices on like this particular passage in Corinthians. That would be an interesting question. But I'm somebody who sees the statistical argument that Payne is making, that these are clearly text critical. They function to identify variants. I think Payne was absolutely right about that. He's just wrong about when that was. It must have happened in the 16th century, not in the 4th century. So as a proponent of the quotation refutation hypothesis, I think we're still securely in the opinion that this is original to the text and not something that was added later.
So shall I go ahead and take this off the screen?
Yeah, you're welcome to if you want.
Or do we still need it?
No, I don't need to refer to it. It's I would be, if you have any questions, I can also talk about sort of the general implications and other sort of
Sure.
side issues.
Uh, yeah, I would like to know the general implications.
So yeah, Vaticanus is not the only key piece of Payne's argument. It's one of them. There are other tricky cases like minuscule 88. That's another important manuscript that has a Western displacement. It has but it's not Western, right? So that's minuscule 88 is a 12th century Byzantine manuscript that has the Western ending for Corinthians, right? So it's weird. And a lot of scholarship suggests it's the only one, but it's not. There's like one other minuscule that's numbered 15, 1500 something. I think I forget the number of the other minuscule with this same displacement, but that's about 100 years newer. So you have basically the Western verse order is only found in North Africa and Italy, and so in the Western Latin realm is where you see this text type for centuries. It's one of the most prominent text types in the Western Empire for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, or a little less than that, maybe. And then it starts to die out. Like people start to favor more the original canonical verse order becomes essentially the only one in the second 1,000 years of Christianity. So like since the medieval period. But you have these couple of weird little anomalous examples of this Western verse order showing up in the Byzantine East in the medieval period. Why would that be? Well, I think personally that it's again because of the rise of scribal literacy. It's because the Byzantine world and the Latin West are constantly exchanging clerical talent, right? Scribes are moving around a lot. People don't just stay their whole lives in one part of the world. And with various, with the Crusades and things like this going on, you have what? You have a lot of people from the West moving into Asia Minor, moving into Byzantium, and going back and forth. So what happened during this period when you had all these Crusader knights showing up, right, in the Byzantine world? They're going to do what? They're going to bring manuscripts with them. And those manuscripts are then going to be available to compare with others. And so some scribe said, and adopted a Western variant reading in what was otherwise a non-Western text type, right? You see how this works? So like Payne thinks, and this is, I find again, hard to believe, Payne says that minuscule 88 is an independent second example of the same displacement. He thinks that he thinks there was a version without it. A scribe read it, copied it, and said, wait, that's wrong. these verses are missing. And so what did he do? He was done with the chapter. He had the chapter finished according to Payne. And then what does he say? He says, where do you add the two verses, two missing verses? You put them on at the end of the chapter, right? So Payne's argument is that the so-called Western displacement happened independently twice in two different contexts. And I don't think that's likely. I think it's simpler to say that the Byzantine scribe for minuscule 88 was aware of the Western type because of the mixing of ideas that's going on in the medieval period, and likely that there are the other aspects that minuscule manuscript, the whole thing shows evidence of multiple text types, right? There are lots of heterogeneous manuscripts. Like even Vaticanus is heterogeneous. Codex Vaticanus is mostly Alexandrian, I think, in its text type, but it has portions of the Gospel of John that are Western, right? Because these different manuscripts weren't perfectly segregated, right? They didn't form like silos. They had overlap and they had exchanges. So you can get kind of like cross-pollination between different regions in the empire, resulting in these transmissions, in my opinion, at least.
Do you think that the person, whoever it was that forged First Timothy, that has that a similar misogynistic verse in there, without the sarcasm that's in First Corinthians 14:34 to 35,
Yeah,
36, do you think that this individual, whoever did that, was copying that, left out the sarcasm to make Paul look like he agrees with the misogynist?
yeah. So what I'll say is that, and this is my article that I published in 22. So it's a couple years old now. I encourage you to link it for your readers, which is Recasting Paul as a Chauvinist in the Western Text Type Manuscript Tradition. In that article, I make the case that the pastoral forger, the pseudo Paul who writes First Timothy, which is very strong case for being inauthentic Paul, that he is indeed imitating the language of First Corinthians. Not just there, but First Timothy imitates the language of First Corinthians in many places, and often changes the thrust, right? So like there are examples like personal conscience. Paul in First Corinthians says you have to let your conscience be your guide, and it's blasphemy otherwise. It's blasphemous to ignore your own conscience and follow rules for rules' sake, right? So Paul's got kind of a little bit of an anti-authoritarian streak, historical, real, like genuine Paul does. But pseudo Paul is the opposite. Pseudo Paul is like follow rules. It's blasphemous to not follow rules, right? So the idea of personal conscience and blasphemy in 1 Corinthians 11, it gets inverted in 1 Timothy, right? So like many of these community rules in 1 Timothy are like the opposite of the way that they're talked about in 1 Corinthians 11. So what's the project? What's Timothy's goal? What's 1 Timothy's author's goal? Is to correct Paul as Paul. So he's saying, I'm Paul, here's what I say. And it's actually, he changes in numerous locations. He changes subtle things about the text of First Corinthians in First Timothy. So like other examples, well, in Romans, Adam is the quintessential sinner. He's like the fallen human is Adam. Whereas in First Timothy, he makes Eve the bad guy, right? First Timothy says for Eve caused Adam to sin, right? So historical Paul is focused on Adam. The pseudo Paul is focused on Eve. You can see the gender stuff start to show up there. So clearly, yeah, the author of First Timothy is a misogynist, in my opinion. And that passage that imitates this one, because it also uses the word permit and silence, right? Silence and I will not permit, right? That's the only time in any letter attributed to Paul that word with that root for permit ever shows up. Now, for a quotation refutation proponent, I'd say that's because it's not him writing, right? He's quoting somebody else. So why is it non-Pauline language? Why is it a verb that Paul never uses otherwise? You see what I'm saying? Because
Yeah.
he's quoting somebody else. He's not writing it himself, but it shows up in this passage in First Timothy. So that's clear, like mechanical imitation. It's like copy paste work with slight changes. But the interpolation proponents, like Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who is a late Catholic scholar, he was an interpolation proponent, kind of like Payne. He argued that, and others have argued that the interpolator, the person who inserted it into First Corinthians, is imitating First Timothy, right? So they're taking, so like, in other words, what they're plucking out of First Timothy this passage and inserting it as a marginal note into First Corinthians, and then the marginal note becomes integrated with the text. So it's kind of the reversal of the gradient that I'm advocating. But I think it's more straightforward to just say that the author of First Timothy is absolutely doing a corrective rendition of Paul. He's making a revision, right, of Paul's persona in a different document. And that revision is then becomes substituted for the real Paul and gets read back onto the historical Paul. Like we read historical Paul through the lens of pseudo Paul. Pseudo Paul becomes kind of like the frame through which we see the historical Paul. His yeah. Oh, and the other question is we don't know which manuscript tradition was being used exactly. I think that the normative exegesis, which starts with Tertullian, is near the very beginning of the Western text type. So why displace the verses? Why move them to the end? It's to shelter them and endorse them, right? By putting them at the end of the chapter, it's conclusive. It's like the chapter ends with, "For it is a shame for women to speak in church," right? It ends with this. The other problem, it uses the law to justify it, right? It says as even as the law says. The historical Paul wasn't often known to cite the law as a justification for Christians doing something different, right? He was somebody who was more likely to problematize the, sort of the use of the law as as the arbitrator in these situations. So that's another reason why you can understand him being skeptical and saying, "What did the word of God originate with you?" Right? Because he's literally opposing something that's very much antithetical to his normal kinds of arguments.
And in my closing question, when Paul is being sarcastic in 1 Corinthians 14, 34, 35, and 36, um, since he's writing to the Corinthian church, is that an indicator that the Corinthian church are the ones that were hesitant about letting women speak in church and lead?
Yeah. So he's responding to one of his people who's a woman, right? I think is it Phoebe? It's like so the letter carrier here is one of his women companions, I think, or the person who's facilitating the correspondence. So this is a congregation he founded, but it's operating without him, and it's a congregation that's mostly Gentiles, so it's mostly converts, not ethnic Jews, with a few ethnic Jewish elites. So like the leadership of the congregation might be Jewish. There's a handful of Jews there, but for the most part, we're dealing with Greco-Roman converts and how they're running it when he's not around, right? Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case that he is telling them that they're telling him that your women, the women that you are associated with, like the John of Patmos might call them Jezebels or whatever. These women that are preaching, they need to stop. They need to be quiet because Greco-Roman law, going back to the time of Aristotle, said women weren't allowed to speak in public assemblies. Right? Aristotle said that women that women, the best woman is a silent woman, right? The best man is a commanding man. Aristotle said women were defective men, like men that were congenital inferiors, children, right? Morally subordinate to males at all times. So if you're dealing with normal Greco-Roman citizens, right, they're going to absolutely think it's really weird to have women leaders, women talking out loud. And so when they cite the law, they're probably citing Greco-Roman law. They're probably saying, even as the law says, women shouldn't speak in the assemblies, right? They're probably not citing any Jewish law, because guess what? There are no rules about not speaking in synagogues in the Torah. There's no passage in the Hebrew Bible that says women shouldn't speak inside a synagogue. That's not in that law. That's not part of the laws of Moses. So that helps you understand. And remember, Paul's an expert. Paul's a Pharisee. Paul comes from a tradition of studying the Torah. So when he says, "What did the word of God originate with you?" he's like calling them out for being ignorant about the text, or for attributing to the law something that isn't there. That's my opinion, and the opinion of others like me who support the quotation refutation reading of this passage, of this very difficult passage. It's not straightforward.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Wilson.
It's a pleasure, and I hope to come back to your channel when I have when there's more developments in this area.
Sounds good to me.
Thanks a lot.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.